The champagne flute caught the light from the chandelier above, and for a moment, everything in that banquet hall went quiet in my ears. Not because the room was silent, but because my whole body had gone still. He was standing at the head table, my son-in-law's father, holding his glass high, already smiling at the crowd the way men like him always smile, like they own every room they walk into. Like the rest of us are just furniture arranged for their comfort. He looked right at me when he said it, and I thought, you have no idea what I'm holding in this purse right now, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where this really starts, because you need to understand what it took to get to that moment, what I gave, what I lost, and what I spent 32 years waiting to do. My husband Gerald died on a Tuesday in March. Our son was 4 years old. I know people say they remember the exact moment their life changed, and sometimes I wonder if that's just something we tell ourselves afterward to make the chaos feel meaningful. But I do remember. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee mug, and the phone rang, and a man with a flat, careful voice told me there had been an accident at the textile plant. Gerald worked in the dye facility. He'd worked there for 6 years, longer than we'd been married. It wasn't glamorous work, and he never pretended it was. But he was proud of being reliable. He showed up early, he stayed late, and he brought home a paycheck that kept us in a small rented house in Millhaven, Tennessee, with the heat on and food in the refrigerator. What the man on the phone didn't tell me, what nobody told me, not for years, was that the accident wasn't an accident. The ventilation system in Gerald's section of the plant had been failing for months. There were internal memos. There were complaints filed by workers. There were reports that someone had seen, reviewed, signed off on, and then quietly buried so that the plant could keep running without the cost of a shutdown. Gerald and 2 other men died from acute chemical exposure over a period of 18 months. The company called it an unforeseen industrial incident. They sent flowers to my door and a check for $4,000 and a letter expressing their deepest condolences. I was 29 years old with a 4-year-old boy and $4,000, and I didn't know yet what they had done. That came later. I raised my son Theo on my own. That's not a sentence I say looking for sympathy. It's just a fact. The same way it's a fact that I worked the front desk at Millhaven Medical Center for 27 years, or that I drove a 2003 Civic until the transmission went out, or that I learned how to fix a leaking faucet from a YouTube video because I couldn't afford a plumber. You do what you do. You don't ask for applause. Theo was a quiet boy who grew into a careful, steady man. He had his father's eyes and his father's habit of going still when he was thinking hard. That particular kind of stillness that looks like calm but is actually the opposite. I watched him grow up in that house, watched him study at the kitchen table under the lamp I'd bought at a yard sale, watched him get his scholarship to University of Tennessee and pack his car and drive away while I stood in the driveway pretending I wasn't falling apart. He called every Sunday, every single Sunday for 4 years of college and 2 years of graduate school. That was Theo. He met a young woman named Ivy during his 2nd year working as an environmental compliance officer for a firm in Nashville. She was sharp and kind and laughed at his terrible jokes. And the first time I had dinner with them, I thought, this one, I could see it. The way she looked at him like he was something worth looking at. What I didn't know, sitting at that dinner table, was who her family was. It was a Thursday evening, maybe 8 months before the wedding, when Theo called and told me her last name for the first time, her full name, her family name, and I had to set the phone down on the counter and just stand there for a minute with my hand pressed flat against the tile. Harwick. Her father was Donovan Harwick, president and majority shareholder of Harwick Industrial Group, based in Nashville, formerly the parent company of Consolidated Textile Operations, which had owned and operated the Millhaven plant where Gerald died. I looked it up that night, then I looked it up again. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night with my reading glasses on and my laptop open, and I traced the corporate structure back through mergers and name changes and subsidiary filings until I was certain. Donovan Harwick had been the regional operations director in 1992. He was 34 years old. He was the man who had received the ventilation complaints. He was the man whose signature was on the internal memo recommending a delayed response pending budget review for the following fiscal year. Gerald died 4 months before that fiscal year began. I had found that memo 11 years earlier through a former plant employee who'd kept a copy out of guilt, who'd mailed it to me with no return address and a handwritten note that said only, "They knew. I'm sorry." I had never been able to do anything with it. The statute of limitations on civil liability had long since passed. The company had restructured. The lawyers I'd consulted told me there was nothing actionable. So I had kept it in a folder inside a box on the top shelf of my closet, and I had tried to move forward with my life. Because what else do you do? But now my son was going to marry this man's daughter. I spent 3 weeks deciding what to do. I didn't sleep well. I walked around the house at night, stood in the dark kitchen, sat in Gerald's old armchair that I'd reupholstered twice but never gotten rid of. I thought about telling Theo immediately. I thought about what that would do to him, to this relationship he was so clearly happy in, to this woman who had done nothing wrong, who didn't choose her father any more than Theo had chosen to lose his. I thought about what Gerald would have said. He would have told me to think carefully. He was always the one who thought carefully. In the end, I made a decision I still question. I decided to wait. Not to protect Donovan Harwick. I want to be very clear about that. But because I needed to understand more. I needed to know whether Donovan Harwick had ever acknowledged what he'd done, whether he'd carried it, whether there was any version of this that didn't require burning everything down. So I said nothing. I watched my son plan his wedding. I went to the engagement dinner and I sat across the table from Donovan Harwick and I shook his hand and I smiled and he had no idea who I was. Why would he? To him, I was just the mother of some young man his daughter had chosen, a widow from a small town. Nobody. That was his first mistake. In the months that followed, I did what I had learned to do over 30 years of being on my own. I worked quietly and I was thorough. I got back in touch with the former employee who'd sent me that memo. His name was Leonard, and he was 71 now and living in Chattanooga, and he had been carrying his own guilt for 3 decades. When I called him and told him what I'd discovered, he cried. Then he told me there was more. He knew of 2 other former workers who had kept documentation. He gave me their names. I contacted a journalist at the Nashville Banner who had written about industrial safety violations the previous year. I didn't tell her everything at once. I just asked if she was interested in a story about corporate negligence and suppressed safety records from the early 90s. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I gathered. I documented. I organized everything in a manila folder that I carried in my purse to every wedding planning meeting, every dinner, every rehearsal. Not because I planned to use it at any of those events, but because I had carried this weight for 32 years and I needed to feel it close. Theo never knew. That's the part that still sits heavy in me. My son planned the happiest event of his life, and I was carrying a secret that could have unraveled it. I told myself I was protecting him. I told myself I would find the right moment after the wedding, when things had settled, when he and Ivy were established in their life together. I still believe I was trying to protect him. I also know I was afraid. Afraid of what he would think of me for waiting. Afraid of what knowing would cost him. The wedding was held at a venue outside Nashville in June, on a day that started overcast and then turned into the kind of afternoon that makes you understand why people get married in Tennessee in the summer. The light came in golden through the trees. There were 240 guests. Theo cried when he saw Ivy walk down the aisle. I sat in the front row on the groom's side and I held my small clutch purse in my lap and I cried too. And for those 20 minutes, I let myself just be his mother, watching my son get married. Donovan Harwick sat on the other side, front row with his wife beside him. He wore a suit that cost more than my first car. He laughed easily and leaned over to speak to people and accepted congratulations with the comfort of a man who has never once doubted his own right to be comfortable. He hadn't looked at me once. The reception moved inside. Tables with white linens, centerpieces, the warm noise of a party doing what parties are supposed to do. I was seated at the family table, a round table near the head table, with Theo's 2 college friends and their wives. Not at the head table, I noticed that. I didn't say anything, but I noticed. The speeches began after dinner. Ivy's maid of honor went first, then Theo's best friend, then Donovan Harwick stood up. He was good at this. I'll give him that. He had the voice and the posture and the timing. He talked about Ivy, about how proud he was, about what he hoped for their future. People laughed at the right moments. He raised his glass, and then he turned toward the family section, and he said, with that particular brand of gracious dismissal that wealthy men deploy so effortlessly, that he was glad Theo had come into their lives. Though of course Theo had come without much of a family to speak of, just a widowed mother. Bless her heart, and that he hoped the Harwick family could offer the kind of foundation and stability that Theo had perhaps grown up without much of a family to speak of. The room didn't go fully silent. Most people probably didn't even register it. It was said smoothly, wrapped in warmth, the kind of insult that has plausible deniability built right in. But the table nearest me shifted. Theo's best friend stopped smiling, and Theo, my son, who catches everything, went very still. I felt my hand close around the clasp of my purse. I had not planned this. I want to say that clearly. I had not come to my son's wedding intending to do what I did next. I had a folder in my purse because I had not yet figured out where else to carry it, and because after 32 years you stop putting things down. But I looked at Donovan Harwick, holding his champagne glass, and I thought about the $4,000 check. I thought about Leonard, 71 years old in Chattanooga, still losing sleep. I thought about the other 2 families, the Porters and the Gillises, who had never gotten anything resembling an answer. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The room noticed me standing the way rooms notice anything unexpected. I said, I'd like to say something, if you don't mind. Donovan Harwick turned. He looked at me the way he'd been looking at me all day, the way you look at something that is pleasant enough but requires no particular attention. I said, my name is Barbara Hollis. Gerald Hollis was my husband. He died in March of 1992 at the Millhaven Consolidated Textile Plant. He was 31 years old and our son was 4. The ventilation system in Gerald's facility had been failing for months. 3 workers died. The company called it unforeseen. I reached into my purse. I said, it wasn't unforeseen, it was reviewed, it was documented, and it was deprioritized, pending budget review, by the regional operations director at the time. I set the folder on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I said, I've spent 32 years being the widow from a small town. I raised that boy at this table without help from anyone, and I am prouder of that than anything I have ever done. He does not come from nothing. He comes from Gerald, and he comes from me. I picked up my own water glass. Congratulations to my son and his wife. I wish them everything good. I sat down. The room was doing something complicated that I can only describe as the sound of 240 people recalibrating. Donovan Harwick had gone pale. His wife had her hand on the table in front of her like she needed something to hold on to. Ivy was looking at her father in a way I had not seen her look at him before. Theo was looking at me. I couldn't read his face, and that frightened me more than anything that had happened in that room. The rest of the evening passed the way these things pass. The cake, the first dance, the gradual dispersal of guests. I sat at my table and I answered questions from the people around me, and I did not go look for Donovan Harwick, and he did not come to find me. Theo found me near the end of the night, outside by the garden lights, where I'd gone to get some air. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood next to me. Then he said, "How long have you known who she was?" I told him the truth. All of it. The phone call 8 months ago, the late nights tracing corporate filings, Leonard, the journalist, the folder. I told him about the memo that had arrived in my mailbox with no return address 11 years after his father died. I told him I had been trying to find the right moment, and the right moment had never come, and then I had run out of time. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "You should have told me, Mom." I said, "I know." He said, I know. He said, I needed to know. I said, you're right. I know you're right. We stood there in the garden, and the music from inside drifted out over the hedges, and my son put his arm around me, and I held on to him the way I used to when he was small, and I was all he had, and he was all I had. And I let myself cry, really cry, for the first time in years. For Gerald. For the years. For the version of this I should have handled differently. He held me. He didn't let go. Ivy came to find us about 20 minutes later. She had been crying too. She sat down beside me on the garden bench, and she took my hands in both of hers, and she said that she had not known, that she had grown up knowing her father was difficult, knowing there were things he didn't talk about, but she had not known this. She asked me if I believed her. I looked at her, this woman my son had chosen, who had his father's same quality of careful stillness, and I said yes. I did believe her. She said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, you don't have to fix it. It's not yours to fix. She said, he needs to answer for it. I said, that's already in motion. The article ran 6 weeks after the wedding. The journalist had been thorough. She'd interviewed Leonard and the 2 other former workers. She'd traced the corporate lineage. She'd obtained the original safety inspection records through a public records request. It was not the front page, but it was substantial. It named Donovan Harwick by name. He issued a statement through his lawyers. Then, 3 months later, with the Harwick Industrial Board beginning to ask uncomfortable questions, he issued a second statement that was something closer to an acknowledgement. His lawyers called it a clarification. Leonard called me after he read it and said it was the first time in 32 years that someone had put that man's name next to the word responsible. That was enough. Not everything, but enough. I won't tell you the rest of my son's story. It's his to live. I'll tell you that he and Ivy are still married, and that she is still the woman I thought she was at that first dinner, and that the past between her and her father is something they are all navigating, slowly, with difficulty, the way families navigate things that don't have clean resolutions. I'll tell you that Theo called me the Sunday after the article came out, as he always does, and he said, Dad would have liked this, I think. I said, he would have liked it to have happened 30 years ago. Theo laughed. That particular laugh he has, quiet, honest, a little sad. Yeah, he said. Me too. I have a photograph of Gerald on my mantle. He's 30 years old in it, wearing a blue shirt, standing in the backyard of our house in Millhaven, holding Theo against his chest. Theo is 2. He's got his father's hands wrapped around one of his small fists, and he's looking at the camera like he's trying to figure out what it is. I've looked at that photograph every day for 33 years. I used to look at it and feel mostly grief. Then I looked at it and felt something slower, a kind of quiet ache that I had just learned to carry. Then for a long time, I looked at it and felt the particular weight of something unresolved. Now I look at it and I feel something I don't have a perfect word for. Not peace exactly, not relief, something more like, I did not let it go. I did not let him be forgotten. I carried it the whole way, and I set it down in the right place. Gerald, I did what I could with what I had. I always did. People ask me sometimes whether I regret waiting as long as I did, whether I should have gone to Donovan Harwick the moment I found out who he was, knocked on his door, made him look me in the eye. I've turned that question over 100 times, the way you turn something worn and familiar in your hands. Here's what I've come to. I don't think life punishes people on a schedule. I don't think the world runs on a system where the right thing always happens at the right time. What I do believe, and I believe it because I have lived it, is that the choices you make compound. The things you do quietly, consistently, without anyone watching, accumulate into something. Donovan Harwick spent 32 years making choices he thought were invisible. So did I. The difference was what we were building. He was building a wall. I was building a record. Gerald used to say that the only thing you really own is your conduct, not your reputation. That's what other people decide, not your circumstances. Those arrive without asking. Just your conduct, what you actually do day after day, when it would be easier not to. I didn't fully understand what he meant when he said it. I was young and I thought he was being old-fashioned. After he died, I started to understand it differently. After 32 years of raising Theo alone, of working the front desk and fixing the faucet and driving that Civic until the transmission gave out, I understood it the way you understand things that have been earned slowly. Donovan Harwick had money and position and the kind of confidence that comes from never being seriously questioned. What he didn't have was patience. He'd spent decades assuming that time was working in his favor, that the longer nothing happened, the safer he was. He confused silence with forgiveness. He confused my stillness with weakness. That's the thing about people who've always had power. They mistake quietness for absence. They look at someone like me, a widow, a working woman, a mother from a small town, and they see a person with nothing to offer and nothing to threaten them with. They don't consider that some people go quiet because they are thinking, because they are gathering, because they have learned, through long necessity, how to be patient. Theo is the best thing I have ever done. Not because he is successful, or because he married well, or because people speak well of him, though all of that is true. Because he is decent. Because he shows up. Because when his mother told him a hard truth at the worst possible moment, he stood next to her in the dark and held on. That doesn't happen by accident. That is the result of 1,000 small choices, his and mine, made over 32 years of ordinary days. I think about Gerald when I think about all of this. I think about what it costs a person to be cut short. All that conduct, all those quiet choices, interrupted. I could not give him more time. But I could make sure that what happened to him was not simply absorbed into silence, the way so many inconvenient things are absorbed when the people involved are nobody important. He was important. He was important to me, and to Theo, and to the 2 other families who lost someone in that facility, and to Leonard, who carried his guilt for 3 decades because he knew the truth and didn't know what to do with it. What I did at that wedding was not revenge. I want to be precise about that. Revenge is something you do for yourself, to feel something. What I did was a correction, a small, public, 32-year overdue correction. I sat back down and I picked up my water glass and I was still shaking and I didn't care. Gerald, I thought, I did not let you disappear. That was enough. That has always been enough.